In 1975, a 23-year-old kid from Modesto, California, climbed onto a motorcycle that had absolutely no business being on a dirt track. The Yamaha TZ750 was a road racing machine, a liquid-cooled, four-cylinder, two-stroke monster originally built to dominate asphalt circuits at nearly 180 miles per hour. But someone had ripped that engine out and welded it into a dirt flat track frame. There was no front brake. The tires were hand-cut road racing slicks. And the first time Kenny Roberts ever sat on this thing was the morning of the race at the Indiana State Fairgrounds. 4 hours later, he won from the last row of the grid, and within months, he voted in favor of rule changes that effectively banned the very machine that made him a legend. But this isn't just the story of one insane motorcycle. This is the story of how an entire engine type was so fast, so dangerous, and so incompatible with where the industry was heading that it was systematically removed from top-level professional racing. Let's go back to where it all started. The Yamaha TZ750 first appeared at the 1973 Tokyo Motor Show, and from the moment it rolled onto that exhibition floor, it was obvious Yamaha was not messing around. Their engineers had designed what was essentially a purpose-built racing weapon disguised as a production motorcycle. The Formula 750 class at the time required manufacturers to build at least 200 units for a bike to qualify as production. So Yamaha built just over 200 examples in the first year, priced them at $3,500 each, and called it a day. Technically legal, practically a full-blown factory race bike with a price tag slapped on the side. Under the bodywork of the TZ750 sat a liquid-cooled inline four-cylinder, two-stroke engine with reed valve induction. That was a first for Yamaha on a road racing machine. The initial 1974 version displaced 694 cubic centimeters and produced about 90 horsepower at 10,500 RPM, fed through 4 Mikuni carburetors and mated to a 6-speed gearbox. That was already terrifying for the mid-1970s. But Yamaha was not done, not even close. By 1977, displacement grew to 747 cubic centimeters, and power jumped to 120 horsepower in the production racer. The factory OW31 variants were the real nightmare. Built in extremely limited numbers for elite riders like Roberts, Giacomo Agostini, and Johnny Cicotto, the OW31 pushed past 140 horsepower, while the complete machine weighed just 335 pounds. Top speed approached 180 miles per hour. Now let me put those numbers in perspective, because they sound like statistics until you compare them to what else existed in 1975. The average American muscle car that year made around 150 horsepower and weighed 3,500 pounds. The TZ750 was producing comparable power in a package that weighed less than your kitchen refrigerator. The power-to-weight ratio was absolutely in another dimension. Australian world champion Kel Carruthers tested the very first TZ750 prototype in late 1973, and his review was, let's just say, not what Yamaha's marketing department wanted to hear. Carruthers basically called it a two-wheel disaster. Above 160 miles per hour, the handlebars would violently shake back and forth in what riders call tank slappers. The frame could not contain the engine's fury. The brakes were barely adequate. The suspension was overwhelmed and overmatched. But the engine was a work of RT. On road courses, the TZ750 was absolutely devastating. Giacomo Agostini, the 15-time world champion who had shocked the entire racing world by leaving MV Agusta for Yamaha, won the bike's debut race at the 1974 Daytona 200. He beat Kenny Roberts by more than 30 seconds. This is worth pausing on because Roberts had publicly declared before the race that he was going to eat Agostini alive. After crossing the finish line a full half-minute behind, Roberts could barely process what had happened. He admitted he could not believe Agostini was a human being. The TZ750 would go on to win 9 consecutive Daytona 200 races from 1974 through 1982. 9 in a row. Nothing else came close. Nothing could touch it. Gene Romero, who won the 1975 Daytona 200 on a TZ750, probably gave the most accurate description anyone has ever offered for what riding this machine felt like. He compared it to putting a V8 engine inside a bicycle. Just sit with that image for a second. All that power, all that fury, channeled through a frame and chassis that was fighting for its life to hold the whole thing together. But the chapter that turned the TZ750 from a great race bike into an immortal piece of motorsport legend did not happen on pavement. It happened on dirt. And this is where the story gets truly wild. By 1975, Harley-Davidson's XR750 had a stranglehold on American Motorcyclist Association flat track racing. American flat track was Harley territory. Yamaha's dirt bikes simply could not match the Harleys on the big mile-long oval tracks, and the entire Yamaha racing operation was frustrated. That's when a frame builder named Doug Schwerma, out of Champion Racing Frames in St. Louis, had what you might generously call a bold idea, or what you might more accurately call a complete disregard for self-preservation. He wanted to yank the TZ750 road racing engine out of its road racing chassis and stuff it inside a flat track frame. He built 6 frames total. K.L. Carruthers personally assembled one of them specifically for Roberts. Let's talk about the specifications for a second because they are genuinely terrifying. The flat track version of the TZ750 made roughly 100 horsepower on dirt. For reference, the Harley XR750s it was going up against made roughly 70 to 80 horsepower. On the mile-long straights at the Indiana State Fairgrounds in Indianapolis, Roberts estimated the TZ750 was hitting 145 to 150 miles per hour. The Harleys topped out around 120 miles per hour. That is a 25 to 30 miles per hour speed difference, entering corners on a dirt oval with no guardrails. And just to make things more fun, the TZ750 flat tracker had no front brake. Flat track bikes do not use them because locking the front wheel on loose dirt means an instant crash. So this 100 horsepower two-stroke missile relied entirely on the rear brake, engine braking, and the rider's ability to manage a throttle that was more like a hand grenade with a twist grip. Roberts also had a kill switch rigged to the handlebars that cut ignition to the number 3 cylinder during corner entry, because the full power output was simply uncontrollable at anything less than straightaway speed. In theory, it should have helped. In practice, Roberts later admitted it barely worked. Releasing the switch sent an instant 30 horsepower surge to the rear wheel, which just caused violent slides in a different way. The tires were not even real dirt track tires. They were modified road racing slicks with treads hand-cut by Carruthers using a razor blade. This whole setup sounds like it was designed by a committee of people who had never heard the word liability. The first time Kenny Roberts ever sat on this machine was during practice at Indianapolis on August 23, 1975. He had never ridden it before that morning. What happened next is one of the most insane stories in the entire history of motorcycle racing. Roberts came screaming out of turn 4 on his very first lap, shifted his weight on the handlebars trying to find some grip, and the motorcycle launched into the air. He nearly looped it completely backward. Right there, first lap, first session, almost dead. A reasonable human being would have parked the bike, thanked Doug Schwerma for the engineering experiment, and walked away. Kenny Roberts was not a reasonable human being. He barely qualified for the main event, finishing 4th in his heat race and scraping through the semi-final by the skin of his teeth. When the final lined up, Roberts sat on the absolute last row of the grid. The green flag waved, and the rear tire on the TZ750 just spun, zero traction. The Harley XR750s thundered away from him down the front straight, while Roberts sat there spinning his rear wheel on the dirt like a dog on a hardwood floor, dead last. But then something incredible started happening. Roberts found an outside line that nobody else was using. Nobody else was going fast enough to need it. He was carving his own racing groove right up against the hay bales that bordered the track, running the TZ750 at speeds that had no right to exist on that surface. Lap after lap, he picked off riders. The bike came back from the race with straw jammed into every crevice and baling wire from the hay bale barriers embedded in the exhaust pipes. That is how close he was running to the absolute edge of the racetrack. At one point during the race, Roberts squeezed between riders Gary Scott and Mert Lawwill, while the TZ750 was completely sideways. There was zero room to spare. The bike was sliding, the barriers were right there, and Roberts just held the throttle open and trusted physics to sort itself out. With 5 laps remaining, Roberts could finally see the leaders. Jay Springsteen and Corky Keener, both aboard Harley XR750s, were running first and second. Springsteen looked back and signaled to Keener that someone was closing fast. Keener misread the signal. He thought nobody was behind them. On the final lap, something happened that Roberts himself could not explain afterward. The TZ750 suddenly found traction. It had not had all race. The rear tire hooked up and the bike launched forward like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Roberts said he figured he might grab third place. Then he shifted gears and realized he was going to get second. And then he came up on Springsteen at the finish line so fast that he nearly collided with the Harley. He swerved to avoid contact and crossed the line first, by inches. The crowd at the Indiana State Fairgrounds lost their minds. Roberts would later say he had never experienced anything like it in his entire career. It remains one of the single greatest performances in the history of American motorcycle racing. His quote after the race became legend. He said, "They don't pay me enough to ride that thing." He was not joking. Now here is where this story takes its most unexpected turn. After the 1975 season ended, the American Motorcyclist Association Rules Committee convened to discuss flat track regulations going forward. 20 members sat on that committee. Among them were Kel Carruthers and Kenny Roberts. The committee voted to impose new rules for the 1976 season: a minimum piston displacement of 335 cubic centimeters, a maximum of 2 cylinders. Those two rules together killed the 4-cylinder TZ750 on dirt permanently. They also eliminated Kawasaki's 3-cylinder H2R, which had been threatening to follow the same insane path. Both Roberts and Carruthers voted in favor of the ban. Roberts explained his reasoning with no sugarcoating. He said the TZ750 was going to kill somebody, and he did not want that person to be him. He also was not blind to the politics behind the decision. He openly admitted that even if the TZ750 managed not to kill anyone, it would absolutely destroy Harley-Davidson's dominance of American flat track. Harley was the commercial lifeblood of the series. The fans came to see Harley's race. The sponsors came because fans came. Kill Harley's competitiveness, and you might kill the entire sport. Carruthers voted the same way and was just as blunt about it. He said flat track was mainly a Harley deal, and it was better to leave it as it was. So the Yamaha TZ750 flat tracker raced exactly one time. It won from the last row, and it was legislated out of existence by the very guy who rode it to victory. That is one of the most compressed, dramatic legends in all of motorsport. But the flat track ban was actually just the appetizer. A much bigger, much more political battle was brewing. It would eventually erase two-stroke engines from Grand Prix motorcycle racing entirely. To understand why two-strokes were considered such an existential threat, you need to understand the engineering that made them special. A four-stroke engine fires once every 2 revolutions of the crankshaft. Intake stroke, compression stroke, power stroke, exhaust stroke. 4 movements, 2 full crankshaft rotations, 1 combustion event. A 2-stroke engine cuts all of that in half. It fires every single revolution. 1 rotation, 1 bang. That means at any given RPM, a 2-stroke is producing twice as many power strokes as a 4-stroke with the same displacement. That does not automatically mean double the horsepower, because 2-strokes lose some efficiency in how they move fuel and air. But it gives them a massive theoretical advantage, and in practice, it translates to significantly more power per cubic centimeter than any 4-stroke can manage. 2-strokes have no camshafts, no valvetrain, and no timing chains. Gas exchange happens through ports machined directly into the cylinder walls. This makes the engine dramatically simpler, dramatically lighter, and far more compact than an equivalent 4-stroke. In racing terms, a 500 cubic centimeter 2-stroke could realistically match or outperform a 1,000 cubic centimeter 4-stroke in raw power output. The secret weapon behind all of this was a suite of technologies pioneered in the 1950s by an engineer named Walter Kayden, who worked at the East German MZ motorcycle factory. Kayden had actually spent part of World War II working at the Peenemünde rocket facility, and he applied pressure wave theory to motorcycle exhaust design. His most famous innovation was the expansion chamber exhaust. These carefully shaped pipes use acoustic waves to essentially supercharge the cylinder without any moving parts whatsoever. A negative pressure wave first pulls a fresh fuel and air charge into the cylinder, then a positive pressure wave stuffs any escape charge right back in before the piston seals the exhaust port. Combined with his work on disc valves and boost ports, Kayden nearly doubled the output of his 125 cubic centimeter MZ engine, taking it from around 13 horsepower to 25 horsepower. The MZ became the first normally aspirated engine to exceed 200 brake horsepower per liter. It was borderline witchcraft. The trade-off is that each expansion chamber is tuned for one specific RPM range. Below that range, the engine feels completely dead. When the RPM hits the sweet spot, power arrives all at once in one massive explosion of acceleration. Two-stroke power bands are narrow and brutal. There is no gentle buildup. It is nothing, then everything. Which brings us to the 500 cubic centimeter Grand Prix era. And if you thought the TZ750 flat tracker was scary, the 500 cubic centimeter Grand Prix machines took that fear and multiplied it. By the late 1990s, Honda's NSR 500 represented the absolute peak of two-stroke racing technology. A V4 two-stroke engine producing approximately 185 to 200 horsepower from just 500 cubic centimeters of displacement packed into a racing motorcycle that weighed 289 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio worked out to roughly 1.5 horsepower per kilogram. That is comparable to, and in some cases exceeding, modern MotoGP power-to-weight ratios, despite the fact that today's bikes have nearly double the engine displacement and decades of additional development. Valentino Rossi, who won the final 500 cubic centimeter world championship in 2001 on that very Honda NSR 500, reportedly ran reduced power settings because the full output of that engine was beyond what any human being could consistently manage without electronic assistance. Think about that for a second. One of the greatest motorcycle racers to ever live was willingly leaving horsepower on the table because the alternative was unrideable. These machines had zero electronic safety nets, no traction control, no anti-wheelie systems, no ride-by-wire throttle mapping to smooth out the power delivery. Kevin Schwantz, the 1993 world champion on the Suzuki RGV 500, described the throttle as being like a light switch, either on or off with absolutely nothing in between. Wayne Rainey, Mick Doohan, Eddie Lawson, Randy Mamola. These riders defined an era where climbing aboard a 500 cubic centimeter Grand Prix two-stroke was, in Rossi's own words, more like going to war than going racing. He said the riders from that era were the bravest he'd ever seen. The real riders, he called them. The 500 cubic centimeter two-strokes earned a nickname that stuck permanently, the Unridables. And this is where the politics enter the picture. Honda, the largest motorcycle manufacturer on the planet, was pushing hard for a shift away from two-strokes. Not purely because they were dangerous, though that was a very convenient argument to make publicly. The real motivation was commercial relevance. Honda's founder, Soichiro Honda, had famously despised two-stroke engines for his entire career. By the late 1990s, no manufacturer was selling two-stroke street bikes in any significant volume. Meanwhile, the World Superbike Championship, which raced production-based four-strokes, was gaining audience share on Grand Prix racing specifically because fans could walk into a dealership and buy something similar to what they watched on Sunday afternoon television. Two-stroke Grand Prix racing had become a closed loop with zero connection to what customers actually purchased. Honda mounted what motorsport journalist Matt Oxley called a brilliant public relations campaign aimed at the FIM, motorcycle racing's governing body, and Dorna Sports, the commercial rights holders. Their pitch was elegant: make the top class about four strokes to reconnect racing with the showroom floor. Safety improves because four strokes deliver power more predictably across a wider RPM range. And manufacturers invest more because the racing technology actually transfers to bikes they sell. To be fair, tightening emissions regulations were also making two-strokes increasingly difficult to justify from an environmental standpoint. Honda had the wind at their back on multiple fronts. In 2002, the Premier class was rebranded as MotoGP with a new equivalency formula. Teams could race either 500 cubic centimeter two-strokes or 990 cubic centimeter four-strokes with up to 6 cylinders. Read those numbers again. The four-strokes got nearly double the displacement. Honda's RC211V debuted with a V5 engine producing approximately 210 horsepower, and the two-strokes were immediately outclassed. All 16 races that season were won by four-stroke machines. Two-strokes scraped together just 5 podium finishes across the entire year. They weren't just beaten, they were humiliated. The last time a two-stroke motorcycle started a Premier Class Grand Prix race was in 2003 at the Czech Grand Prix at the Brno circuit. After that, the two-stroke was functionally extinct at the highest level of the sport. But the purge did not stop there. The 250 cubic centimeter two-stroke class was replaced by Moto 2, running 600 cubic centimeter four-stroke engines in 2010. The 125 cubic centimeter class became Moto 3, running 250 cubic centimeter four-stroke engines in 2012. The absolute final two-stroke Grand Prix race took place in Valencia, Spain on November 6, 2011. An entire engine philosophy was wiped out across every class in the span of a decade. In motocross, the exact same pattern played out through displacement equivalency rules. Officials forced 250 cubic centimeter two-strokes to compete directly against 450 cubic centimeter four-strokes. That is like making a welterweight fight a heavyweight and calling it fair. James Stewart won the last AMA Pro Motocross national event on a two-stroke machine back in 2004. After that, the four-strokes took over completely at the professional level. Two-strokes hung on in amateur classes, off-road racing, and club events. But at the top, gone. If you are enjoying this deep dive into motorcycle racing history, hit that subscribe button. We put out stories like this every week, and honestly, the next one might be even wilder than this. Now here is what makes this whole saga bittersweet. The two-stroke engine was phased out largely through rule changes rather than any straightforward failure in performance. It had real limitations, sure. Emissions were awful, fuel efficiency was poor, and the peaky power delivery was genuinely dangerous. But on raw speed per cubic centimeter of displacement, nothing touched it. The technology did not lose on the track. The rules were rewritten until there was nowhere left for it to race. Today, original Yamaha TZ750s sell at auction for $50,000 to $75,000. Factory OW31 variants, if one ever surfaces from the approximately 550 to 600 total units that were produced, reach well into six figures. HRMA vintage racing events around the world still feature TZ750s screaming through corners, their expansion chambers wailing at that unmistakable two-stroke pitch. The Bikers Classic at Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium regularly hosts 500cc Grand Prix parade laps with period machinery. In 2009, a 57-year-old Kenny Roberts returned to the Indianapolis Mile for a demonstration ride aboard a restored TZ750 flat tracker. Valentino Rossi was standing in the crowd watching. Roberts warned the audience beforehand that he was hoping the old instincts would come back, because if they did not, there would be a yellow speck in the dirt down in turn 1. Then he took off. Rear wheel spinning, bike fishtailing sideways on the dirt, pure, undiluted Roberts. 3 decades older and still absolutely unhinged. The two-stroke is not entirely dead outside of Premier Class competition. KTM introduced the world's first fuel-injected two-stroke enduro motorcycles in 2018, and by 2025 their entire SX motocross range features electronic fuel injection. The Langen two-stroke, a boutique hand-built V-twin making 76 horsepower at just 251 pounds, represents a tiny but passionate road-legal revival. In off-road racing, two-strokes survive because they are cheaper, lighter, and simpler to maintain than four-stroke alternatives. But in top-level road racing, the two-stroke is gone, permanently. The Yamaha TZ750 flat tracker sits in Motorsports Hall of the Impossible alongside the Brabham fan car and the Group B rally cars. Machines so extreme that the rulebooks had to be rewritten just to keep them off the track. But the TZ750 holds a distinction that none of those other legendary machines can claim. Its own rider looked at what he had accomplished, understood that the motorcycle would eventually kill someone, and voted to destroy his own legend. Roberts summed it up years later with the kind of quiet understatement that only makes sense when you have ridden a 100 horsepower two-stroke on dirt at 150 miles per hour with no front brake and hand-cut tires. I'm just glad I lived to tell the story. If this one had your engine revving, you're going to want to check out this video right here. I'll see you there.